Welcome to Mill History Talk, the podcast where we explore the past to better understand the profession of arms today. We dive into the campaigns, conflicts, issues, and commanders that have shaped military thinking across centuries, and why it all still matters. Whether you're an officer in training, a seasoned professional, a student of strategy, or simply curious about how history informs modern warfare, this space is for you. Our mission is simple: to foster insight, reflection, and critical thinking primarily through the lens of military history. Before we begin, a quick note. The views expressed in this podcast are of the podcast writers, hosts, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency or organization. So, whether you're listening in a barracks, a lecture hall, at the gym, or in your car on the way to work, welcome. We're glad you're here. Hey everyone, I'm Hope, your tour guide through history's war rooms, where the gossip is strategic and the drama is continental. Welcome back to Mill History Talk. Today we're diving into the life and ideas of a man who tried to turn war into geometry homework, Antoine-Henri Jomini. Don't worry, no math quiz at the end. Probably.
And I'm Brian. While most people have heard of Clausewitz and his famous line about war being the continuation of politics, fewer know Jomini, the Swiss soldier who believed war could be codified into rules. Yet for much of the 19th century, his books were required reading from West Point to St. Petersburg.
So picture this: Switzerland, 1779. Young Antoine-Henri Jomini is supposed to grow up, crunch numbers, and work in banking. But instead, like every good history nerd, he's doodling maps of Frederick the Great's campaigns instead of balancing ledgers.
He did try finance, even working in Paris as a currency broker during the Revolution. But his real break came when he snagged a job at the Helvetic Republic's Ministry of War. That staff experience gave him a lifelong appreciation for logistics and organization.
So he's basically the kid who joined student government just to get closer to the action. And it worked. He ends up writing a huge book on Frederick the Great's campaigns. Marshal Ney reads it, thinks, this guy knows his stuff, and brings him along for Napoleon's wars.
Correct. Jomini served in major campaigns: Ulm, Jena, Eylau, and Napoleon himself eventually made him a baron. But Jomini's Swiss background gave him flexibility. In 1813, he switched sides and joined the Russians as an advisor to Tsar Alexander I. That defection earned him critics, but also secured his long-term career as a thinker and teacher of war.
Talk about playing both sides. But hey, if you've got a brain full of strategy maxims, everybody wants your notes.
Jomini's reputation really rests on his writings. Where Clausewitz was famously difficult and philosophical, Jomini wanted to provide clear, actionable guidance. Think of Clausewitz as the professor who assigns you a dense, 500-page theory book, while Jomini is the one who makes you a color-coded study guide. His most famous work, Précis de l'art de la guerre, that's Summary of the Art of War, published in 1838, pulled together decades of his ideas, and at the core were a handful of principles that he believed every officer should know.
All right, let's hear them. Jomini's 4 horsemen of strategy.
Close enough. First, lines of operation. For Jomini, an army's supply and communication lines were the nervous system of a campaign. He argued that if you protect your own lines while threatening the enemy's, you gain both security and freedom of movement. Lose your lines and you risk collapse. Think Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812.
So it's like keeping your Wi-Fi connection stable during an online game, because if you lose the line, you're toast.
Second, decisive points. Jomini believed every campaign turned on certain critical spots. Maybe a fortress guarding a river crossing. Maybe a supply hub. Maybe even a portion of the enemy's army that was isolated. Identify those decisive points, strike at them, and you could win disproportionately large results.
So the boss fight location. You beat that, the whole level falls into place.
Exactly. Third, concentration of force. He insisted that commanders should avoid scattering their armies across a wide front. Instead, mass combat power at the decisive point. Jomini argued that history showed, time and again, that the side able to focus strength against a weaker portion of the enemy usually prevailed. This is where his chessboard analogies come in. Move your pieces together, strike where your opponent is thin, and avoid being divided.
So, don't split the party. Classic Dungeons and Dragons advice.
Clausewitz might have written about friction, chance, and fog. Jomini would have said, "Don't split your army. It'll end badly."
He's not wrong.
The fourth principle is offensive action. Jomini admired bold, decisive maneuver. He argued that taking the initiative kept the enemy reactive and allowed you to impose your will on the battlefield. But he also warned that reckless offensives could stretch your lines too far and invite disaster. He respected Napoleon's aggressiveness, but he also documented the times when overextension cost dearly.
So, strike first, but don't drunk text at 2 a.m. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
That's one way to put it.
And all of this was wrapped up in geometry, right? Like literally angles and bases?
Yes. Jomini described campaigns using terms like interior lines, bases of operation, and strategic pivots. He'd illustrate them with diagrams that look like math class: arrows, lines, triangles. He thought war could be reduced to a science, almost like engineering.
Which is wild, because war is also chaos, politics, human fear, and luck. But I get why 19th century generals loved it. Instead of wrestling with Clausewitz's philosophy, they could grab Jomini and feel like they had a playbook.
Exactly. His critics said he oversimplified, but that simplicity was the source of his influence. Officers from Paris to West Point loved the clarity. For a long time, if you wanted to learn strategy, you didn't start with Clausewitz. You started with Jomini.
Okay, so here's the fun part. Jomini becomes a hit in the United States. His Art of War gets translated in 1862, but even before that, West Point cadets were getting a full dose of Jominian wisdom, thanks to Professor Dennis Hart Mahan.
Exactly. Civil War generals on both sides absorbed his concepts. Robert E. Lee used interior lines during the Peninsula Campaign, and Grant applied the idea of decisive points at Vicksburg. Jomini's rules didn't guarantee success, but they gave officers a shared vocabulary to think about operations.
So basically, while the rest of America was quoting Shakespeare and the Bible, Civil War officers were quoting Jomini. He was the strategic influencer of the 19th century.
Even after the Civil War, Jomini's influence persisted. The U.S. Army's principles of war, first codified in 1921, still echo him. Objective, offensive, mass, maneuver, and security are all straight from Jomini's playbook. And those principles continue in today's Army doctrine and joint publications.
Which blows my mind that something written in the 1830s still shows up in Pentagon PowerPoints.
It does. For example, the U.S. Joint Publication on Operations still stresses identifying decisive points and maintaining secure lines of communication. That's pure Jomini. When modern strategists talk about protecting supply chains in the Pacific or maintaining freedom of movement in contested environments, they're essentially reusing Jominian categories.
So the guy who loved straight lines and decisive points would feel right at home in a briefing about aircraft carriers and logistics in the South China Sea.
In some ways, yes. His influence also shows up in historical operations. The Gulf War's famous left hook, where coalition forces massed overwhelming combat power at a decisive point in 1991, was a classic Jominian maneuver. Even in Afghanistan and Iraq, planners thought in terms of decisive points, whether cities like Kandahar or critical supply routes. His framework remains useful, even if imperfect.
But we've also seen the limits, right? Like in counterinsurgency wars, you can mass all the force you want at a decisive point, but if you don't win the politics, it doesn't work.
Exactly. That's where Clausewitz comes in, reminding us that war is always political. Jomini gave us clarity, but sometimes too much clarity. He downplayed the messiness of insurgency, irregular war, and politics. Still, his principles remain a foundation. They give officers a way to think about structure before grappling with complexity.
So in other words, he's not the whole toolbox, but he's the first tool you reach for.
Precisely. Even in new domains like cyber or space, strategists still talk about decisive points and secure lines of operation. Those concepts still organize how we plan and think. Jomini lived to 1869, long enough to see breech-loading rifles, railways, and even comment on the Austro-Prussian War. He wasn't just a theorist in an ivory tower. He served, he advised, and he left behind a system that shaped how officers thought about war for over a century.
And that's our tour of Jomini, the Swiss baron who tried to make war as clear as a geometry problem. Love him or hate him, his maxims still echo in classrooms, war colleges, and yes, even in Pentagon PowerPoints. And that's a wrap on today's March Through History. Thanks for hanging out with us. I'm Hope, and this has been Mill History Talk. If you enjoyed learning about Jomini, share this episode, drop some strategy talk at dinner, and make your friends wonder when you became a Napoleonic war nerd. Until next time, keep your strategy sharp, your humor sharper, and don't let Clausewitz and Jomini start an argument in your head. Catch you next time.
And remember, wars may be fought by men, but they're still won or lost by logistics. See you next episode.